Welcome to the next word. I'm your host, Chris Warnke, and today we have a very special guest in Congressman Brendan Boyle, who represents the 2nd District of Pennsylvania and a true rising star. Congressman, welcome to the next word. I'm so thrilled to have you today to talk about the myriad of issues, and today's a very important day in Congress, given the American Rescue Plan. But before that, I want to talk to you a little bit about you. I mean, you're the first in many ways. You are the first to attend college in your family. You were the first to run for office. Um, you have an amazing career already. You chose a career path of obviously politics, but you could have gone a number of different ways. You came from an Irish immigrant father, so I know you have really strong Irish roots. Can you talk to me about that? Just because I know people want to know, you're the only member that comes from an immigrant father. And I can appreciate that, believe me.
Yeah, yeah. Well, it's first. Thanks for having me, Christine, and it's great to get a compliment, especially from someone who's had such a remarkable career herself. As you mentioned, I'm the son of Irish immigrant. My mom was American born, but both of her parents had just come from Ireland only a couple of years before she was born. So I very much grew up in an immigrant household between my father and then my grandparents, my mother's parents, who literally lived around the block from us. We grew up in a very almost stereotypical Philadelphia row home neighborhood, and that's obviously a big part of who I am in terms of forming me. And so went on to be the first of my family to go to college, and then later went on to graduate school. So I think what's interesting is that if you look at now, I'm 44, and if you look at the things I've been fighting for the last 6 years as a member of Congress, and you look at my family background, you can see just what a big influence that had in terms of my political views, whether it's on immigration, or fighting for unions, or fighting for forgotten working class America. Obviously, there's a pretty direct, straight line from my background and the way I was raised to now the things I fight for in Congress.
And absolutely, and we're so lucky to have you. And truly, and I know how hard you are working for the working class. And of course, today there's a discussion, as we know, on the floor for the American Rescue Plan. And so much of it is for Americans who they have been very vocal in their support for this rescue plan. And thank you. And as vice chair, actually, of the budget committee in the House, I know you had a big hand in this. So a little bit about the plan, because I know it's
Yeah, look, the American Rescue Plan. I mean, I recheck these numbers because I half can't believe it. So I'm constantly rechecking the poll numbers, and it is remarkable. The approval rating is between 75 and 80%. 5 different opinion polls have now showed that. Not only do a majority of Democrats and a majority of independents support the American Rescue Plan, but so do a majority of Republicans. It's pretty remarkable. And if you think of my lifetime, and you go back and you look at Gallup polls, this is actually the single most popular economic plan of any president of my lifetime. So the opportunity to have a hand in crafting it, which I did, and then the opportunity to vote for it. Actually, I'm one of the few people in Congress right now who's already voted for it 3 times because I'm vice chair of the Budget Committee. I am a member of the House Ways and Means Committee, so both of my committees had to approve it. And then, of course, I voted for it as a member of the full House. And then I'll be voting for it a 4th and final time coming up here pretty soon, which is the last step before President Biden signs it. So you have the $1,400 stimulus payments per person as long as it's under the income cap. You have, very importantly, the increase in the child tax credit, which is projected to cut child poverty in half in the United States of America, perhaps the single biggest cut in child poverty since the Lyndon Johnson programs of the 1960s. You have the over $100 billion to restart schools and to do so safely. As the father of a first grader and the husband of a public school teacher, I certainly care about that provision. You also have the money in there for state and local governments, which is really important because so many state governments, and it's blue states and red states, So many state governments and so many municipal governments have just been blown apart because of the COVID crisis and the drop in revenues that they've experienced with all of the drop in economic activity. We also have a provision in there on retirement security, a pretty landmark provision that a lot of people don't know about even. So there's just a lot of things in a bill that's $1.9 trillion. It's one of the largest bills in American history, and I think one of the most significant as well.
Congressman, talking about the retirement plan, I know there was a piece in the bill about multi-employer pension plans, and I know you've been an advocate, and so thank you, because what I know of what you've done in your own district, but also the state and of course in the country. Can you talk a little bit about that in terms of those plans? And
So important. I mean, my own father lives right now off two pensions that he paid into as a first as a warehouse worker for 25 years. He has a Teamsters pension, and then as a municipal worker, as a janitor for our subway system in Philadelphia, he has another small pension as a member of the Transport Workers Union, and combined, between 40 and 50 years worth of work. Well, that's a pension that he paid into that he now relies on along with Social Security in order to live a comfortable retirement. And he's an example of millions of similar workers and retirees in the United States. And so we have an obligation to make sure these pension plans don't go under. So we've been able to do with this, working with both the private sector as well as some labor unions, provide not a bailout, provide the sort of relief that these plans need in order to finally get back up to full funding and to get on more secure ground. So it's really important, and it's something that I personally feel very strongly about. I mean, frankly, if the two pension plans that my father relies on were to go under, I don't know what he would do in retirement. And so he's just one example of the millions who would be affected by this. So I'm very proud that that provision was able to get into this COVID relief bill. It's something that we've needed to do in Congress, and I'm glad we're finally getting it done.
no, great. It was congratulations and thank you, because people have really, now what we've seen the last year, people have really delved into their personal savings.
Yes.
And what did they do? I mean, I guess they're looking to Congress to determine, are there new tools that can be given to save more. Their savings have been obliterated in many cases. Their 401ks. I mean, is this something Congress is going to have to look at in the next year?
Yeah, overall, especially given the changing age demographic in our country, really when we approach the year 2030, we're going to have a challenge when it comes to retirement funding. Obviously, Social Security is going to come under some funding pressure unless we get more revenue into the system. The economic decline and the deep recession that we've experienced because of COVID hasn't helped the Social Security Trust Fund. It's actually moved forward the date by which it will go insolvent. That's something that a lot of people aren't paying attention to today because people are understandably focused on the immediate crisis in front of us. But we had before COVID, we had until about 2035 to solve the Social Security shortfall. Now we only have to about 2032. Yeah. So 3 years were chopped off of that as a result of COVID. So we will continue even after this bill needing to solve the retirement issue. And I've always looked at, your retirement as kind of a three-legged stool. You have Social Security, which should be the most secure. It doesn't necessarily get you a high rate of return, but it's guaranteed. It's 100% secure. You then have, your pension if you have the opportunity that you're still at an employer that provides a traditional pension. And then you have your 401k and your IRA and those sort of tax deferred retirement vehicles. And in a modern 21st century retirement, you really need all three legs of that stool in order for the stool to be stable.
Absolutely. No, absolutely. So, and now that you're the vice chair, and this is a new role for you,
That's
of
right.
the House Budget Committee, correct?
Yeah, that's right, and it's great timing. I mean, being vice chairman of an important committee, but then when we are in the majority and we are pushing some of the most important legislation in the last half century, it's great timing, and it's really fulfilling to have the opportunity to be able to work on such important legislation.
Absolutely. In the Washington Post today, there was an article about the business winners and losers, and talked about the restaurants are winners, aviation manufacturers are winners, um, concert venues are winners, but then there were losers. And I know this is near and dear to your heart, but senior citizen care centers were part of the losing. I guess they put in the losing category. I mean, how did you all come to? How did you come to these
Yeah.
kinds of discriminations?
When you say winners and losers, you're talking about in terms of who
The rescue
benefited from the
plan.
bill.
Mhm.
Yeah. So one of the things and of course, anytime you have major legislation like this, there are going to be a lot of hands in it between the House and the Senate and the White House and then the various committees. Um, I would point out that when you're talking about the restaurants, for example, when you look at restaurants and the hospitality sector at large, it's hard to find a sector that has been harder hit by the COVID shutdowns than restaurants and the hospitality sector. So in this legislation, what we've been trying to do is provide more relief to, frankly, those areas that need it. Now, anytime you do a bill like this, it's not going to be perfect, and you're not going to get. I didn't get everything that I wanted. So what I would say is this isn't going to be the last piece of legislation. I think it'll be the last very big legislation. But look for after this still sector specific bills to be able to help folks. I don't think there's any question that certainly nursing homes and adult care centers were really hard hit. I mean, you just look at the statistics in terms of who this pandemic most affects, where the death rates are the highest. You are looking at those nursing homes and adult care centers. So I do think there's a strong argument for providing them more relief. But I am glad though that other sectors that have been hard hit, especially the restaurant industry, will be able to get some help out of this.
We today we had a discussion about here in Washington D.C. about just dry cleaners. Um,
Yes. Yeah.
75% of the dry cleaners here in the nation's capital will not reopen.
That's amazing. 75%.
75%. That was the figure
Yeah.
I was given today.
Look, I even know for myself that, frankly, the amount of money I've been able to save on dry cleaning
It's a dry
the last year. So I have to say I'm guilty of that
right.
myself. When you're doing these Zoom calls and you're wearing a nice suit, you're still having to get the suit jacket and dress shirt maybe dry clean, but you're wearing shorts underneath or something like that.
Right.
But that shows also when we talk about a K-shaped recovery, this is a perfect example. So if you have a job in which you're able to do it by Zoom or you're able to do it remotely, then this pandemic has been a pain. However, it's been manageable. You're still employed. You're still doing well. But if you're in a profession that isn't in the knowledge economy, that is more blue collar related, this has been devastating.
Yes.
And so that's something we already had an inequality problem in the United States going into COVID, an inequality problem at historic levels that deeply concerns me. Now that has just been completely exacerbated as a result of COVID. So moving out of this, I really want to make sure we focus on closing that wealth gap. And when I say closing the wealth gap, if there are more millionaires, fine. I believe in capitalism. God bless them. I just don't want to see the middle class shrinking, which
Right.
is what has happened in the last 20 years in the United States.
Absolutely.
According to Pew Charitable Trust, that have done a lot of study of this, this is the first generation where the percentage of Americans who are middle class has declined, and the percentage of those who are below the poverty line has increased. That's not consistent with who we are as Americans. We've always been a country that believes in a big middle class, believes in a big middle. And that's what's most stable for our country, the most stable for the sustaining of our democracy. And it concerns me when you see the middle class declining. And I think that this was a problem again before COVID, but now afterwards, it's even more of a problem.
And of course, we're seeing a widening the racial divide, which is
Yeah, that's part of it, right?
oh, we're going to take a short break and we will be right back to talk about your ultra millionaire tax.
Focus on what you can control, like wearing a mask, frequent hand washing, and social distancing. For more tips, visit coping-19.org.
Welcome back. I'm your host, Chris Warnke of The Next Word. And today we're having a conversation with Congressman Brendan Boyle, who represents the 2nd District in the great state of Pennsylvania and a true political rising star in Congress. And I have to say, Congressman, you are amazing, a rising star. And I tell that to everybody. So we have a lot. I could tell you a lot of people are counting on you. And I know they're counting on you. And you just introduced legislation called the Ultra Millionaire Tax, which really will benefit, I think, a lot of Americans in this country. So talk a little bit about that and what your colleagues have done in the House as well as in the Senate.
I believe in capitalism. I think actually capitalism is the economic system, which of course we've always had, and it is the economic system that's the most compatible with liberal democracy. So no one should dispute that, even though anytime someone comes up with an idea from my side of the aisle, it tends to get labeled socialism or even communism by some. It isn't at all. What this does is says, kind of similar to what we were talking about before, there have been record gains at the very top. And when I say the very top, I'm not talking about the top 10% or even the top 1%. I'm talking about less than the top less than 1/10 of 1%, which, by the way, has made trillions of more dollars in the last 12 months during COVID. So even as other people have fallen behind, we have seen the top 1/10 of 1%, even the top 1/2 of 1/10 of 1% do better than ever. And most of the gains are going there. And so it worries me that when we see, by some measures, this is the worst it's been since the 1920s. And we know what happened, what the 1920s led to in 1929. By other measures, it's actually unprecedented that we've never had this sort of wealth inequality. So what our tax does is it is a 2-cent tax, 2% tax on those with wealth over $50 million. And then it goes up by a couple pennies more if you have wealth of $1 billion or more. And most of the revenue, frankly, comes from the billionaires. Um, I'm very heartened by the fact that the polls show that says solid majority support in the United States, including, by the way, a plurality of Republicans who see the wisdom in this. It would raise $3 trillion. So think of what we could do with that $3 trillion, from shoring up Social Security to improving our infrastructure, to improving our education and healthcare systems, to paying down debt. I mean, obviously, we've been spending a lot of money the last several years, and especially with these COVID relief bills. At some point, we will have to turn to raising revenue. I would much rather raise the revenue from the top 1/2 of 1% than to tax middle class and working class residents of my district, or residents of Montgomery County, Maryland, or residents of any county throughout the US.
And the Republican support, I mean, in terms of, getting some Republican support to help carry the message over the finish line.
Like we saw with this COVID bill, there's a real disconnect between Republican voters and then the Republican elected members of Congress. So if you remember from our conversation on the COVID bill, I talked about how polls show a majority of Republicans support it, and yet not one Republican in the House and not one Republican in the Senate voted for it. Unfortunately, I think the ultra millionaires tax would probably have the same fate. Even though so many Americans support it, they see the wisdom in it. They realize this is not taking all of the money from the well. I mean, a 2% tax is hardly confiscatory. It's certainly a pretty sensible proposal, and that's why a large majority of the American people support it, including a plurality of Republican voters. And yet, unfortunately, partisanship is such on the other side. I would be surprised if you saw Republican members at this moment support it. Now, perhaps you'll see a change on the other side of the aisle, but unfortunately for now, I think there is such a penalty on their side of the aisle in their primaries. There's such a penalty on those members who work with Democrats that it actually makes it more challenging, even when the Republican member of Congress will privately tell you that he wants to work with you. It's still a challenge to get their support.
But it's like everything, you need to take the first steps.
Yeah. Yeah.
Say with legislation, it always goes through a number of
Yeah. I just see this as common sense. And I think it's appropriate when you know that so much of the wealth that things have really gotten skewed the last 20, 25 years, as opposed to where we were in that post World War II era of the 50s and 60s when you saw everyone doing well, when you saw economic growth equally distributed. You saw the top 10% doing well, but you also saw the middle 80% and even the bottom 10% rising. And then, over the last 25, 30 years, things really started to diverge. And that's something that we need to correct, while at the same time, we still need to raise revenue in order to address these very important priorities.
So, what do you say to the critics of the minimum wage, $15 minimum wage? Because I know you fought for that as well.
Yeah. So a couple things. First, keep in mind the last time the minimum wage was raised, the last time Congress voted to raise it, was 14 years ago in 2007. It took effect then in 2009. So that was a dozen years ago. This is the longest we have gone without an increase in the minimum wage since the minimum wage was created almost a century ago. That's just wrong. We know that no one can live on $7.25 an hour. If you work full time, if you do the math, work 40 hours a week at a minimum wage job, you make a little over $14,000 a year. You are below the poverty line. That doesn't make any sense, and I believe it's morally wrong. So raising the minimum wage is important. I have fought for the $15 minimum wage. If people are concerned about that, bear in mind it wouldn't go to $15 overnight. It is phased in over a period of time of several years. I think it's the right thing to do. We voted for it in the House. Unfortunately, it didn't survive in the Senate. But we're going to come back to this. We do need to raise the minimum wage. And I am confident that in this term in Congress, we will get it done. I don't know if we'll be able to get 15 in the Senate because I don't think they have 51 votes for that, unfortunately. But I do think we will be able to raise it substantially this term in Congress.
Yeah. Well, going back to your roots and your Irish roots.
Yeah.
I know you're a big proponent of Ireland. You're also very much involved in the E3 visa program, which a lot of people don't know about, which frankly, I didn't know much about. You're trying to change it. Can you talk a little bit about that?
Yeah, so you mentioned earlier that I'm actually the only member of Congress with an Irish-born parent. Even though, especially this time of year around St. Patrick's Day, we look at all the Americans with Irish surnames or people who are quarter Irish and celebrated on St. Patrick's Day. And even maybe, a few people who aren't Irish but
Right.
still celebrate St. Patrick's Day, which we welcome. But that actually, even though there's so many Americans of Irish descent, 30 to 40 million, actually, Irish immigration to the U.S. has been a net of zero over the last generation. My father came to America when he was 19, searching the American dream. He came a half century ago. And since his time, Irish immigration to the U.S. has been very little. And there are a couple reasons for that. First is Ireland's economy is obviously 180 degrees different nowadays from where it was, half a century ago and a century and 2 centuries ago. Instead of a very poor country, it's actually a pretty wealthy country and has done very well in the knowledge economy. So that's part of the reason. Thank God there isn't the need for mass emigration the way there was in previous generations. But there's also another aspect for those Irish who want to emigrate and would like to come to America. It's very difficult. And so they end up going to Canada or going to Australia or going to other European countries because it's just so difficult to come to the US. Because of the rules that are in place today, Ireland doesn't even rank in the top 100 when it comes to countries by the number of visas that they've received to come here. And I think, that's a tragedy. You can say, obviously, I'm biased of Irish descent, but I think any American would acknowledge the special links that we have, and that it's really unfair to now almost penalize the Irish of today. So there's a small visa program, is very small, only a few thousand visas, but that would actually make a world of difference. It would reopen that pipeline between the US and Ireland. So I think it's fair. It's not an issue that gets a lot of attention because when we're talking about the immigration issue, we're usually talking about the 11 million undocumented. And we're talking about, a large majority of them are obviously from Latino or Hispanic countries. The Irish immigration part of it is tiny, but it's still an important part. And, the US-Irish relationship is important. Amazingly, Ireland is one of our top 10 trading partners, even though it's only a country of 5 million people. So the reality is we still have a pretty important relationship there with one of our closest European allies.
It's shocking. I didn't realize it was 5 million. That's right. It's you were one of the first people to endorse President Joe Biden when he decided to run for president. So you saw a lot in the vice president at that time, and you were really, really, truly. Am I right? You were one of the first people, public figures.
Yeah, I was actually the first member of Congress to endorse him.
Wow.
Endorsed him about 45 minutes after he officially announced that morning, almost exactly 2 years ago. And so I was out there campaigning for him in Iowa and New Hampshire and all the way through up to and including Election Day in my own very important state of Pennsylvania. We have a great picture that we took outside my campaign office in Northeast Philadelphia 2 days before Election Day, the Sunday before the election. Joe came to my campaign office to do an event with me. We have a great picture just here in my office of Joe with my daughter, which we'll always cherish. I mean, he's just great in that way. And so it was nice that it came full circle from the very beginning of the campaign, and then through, some pretty tough times in the early states, to then culminating in my own state of Pennsylvania, putting him over the top.
Absolutely. And you lost, of course, a great chief of staff, and now he's at the White House. But
my loss is America's gain.
It's America's gain, exactly.
Yeah. So Christine, as you know, my now former chief John McCarthy left me to join he was pretty high up in the Biden campaign and now works in the West Wing. And so very proud of him. So we've been on Team Biden from day one.
Right. America is fortunate to have him.
Yeah.
On that wonderful note, I say thank you so much for doing this, and good luck. And we need all the energy you can get to go into the next round, but we're fortunate to have you there. So thank you.
Yeah, well, thank you. This has been a pleasure. It's really gone by very quickly.
Yeah.
And look forward to when we can talk again.
Thank you. Yes, thank you. You've been watching The Next Word. Thank you very much. Good night.
If you're even considering getting your high school diploma, go get it. You can do it.
Find free adult education classes near you at finishyourdiploma.org.